If you love mysterious, emotional, and mind-bending stories about science, faith, and the unknown, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter. Because what you're about to hear is not just a story about alien signals or government secrets. It's about the line between God and the cosmos and the woman who dared to cross it. The first time Dr. Evelyn Cross heard the sound, it wasn't through the speakers of her lab but inside her skull. A faint vibration, delicate as a whisper through bone, pulsed behind her right ear. It was 2:47 a.m. amidst cognitive signal analysis lab, the kind of hour when time felt suspended and thought turned liquid. The hum of the fluorescent lights had faded into a white mist of fatigue. Only the monitor's glowed her constellation of data, neural graphs, and deep space signal readings from the Perseus array. She rubbed her temples, squinting at the stream of numbers crawling across her screen. Her research wasn't meant to deal with extraterrestrial signals. She was a neuroscientist, not an astrophysicist. Collective Mind Initiative was about mapping shared patterns in human thought, finding proof that consciousness could synchronize across multiple brains. And yet, somehow, her algorithms had caught something not human. The waveform looked wrong, not chaotic, not random, but impossibly ordered, as if a language of emotion had been carved into radio static. Every frequency spike mirrored the neural rhythms of a dreaming mind. She leaned closer. "This can't be right," she whispered. Outside, Cambridge slept under a blanket of frozen fog. Inside, Evelyn's pulse thudded like a metronome out of time. Her mother's voice flashed unbidden in her memory, warm, firm, prophetic. "If you ever hear God speak, Evelyn, it won't be through words. It will be through patterns only your soul recognizes." Evelyn closed her eyes. The pulse behind her ear deepened. For a moment, she could feel the signal, not hear it, not see it, feel it. A texture of thought, a sadness older than time. And within it, an image burned across her mind, a single eye suspended in darkness, reflecting a dying star. The lab lights flickered. When she opened her eyes, the data stream had shifted on its own. The signal now formed a perfect symmetrical wave. And then, for less than a second, her name appeared in the data. Evelyn Cross, her breath caught. She backed away from the console, her hands trembling. "Impossible," she whispered. Moments later, her phone buzzed. The caller ID, Dr. Michael Reyes. "Michael," her voice cracked. "You're seeing it too," he said without greeting. His tone was calm, but beneath it, she could hear the tremor of disbelief. "The Perseus feed your terminal just registered a duplicate pattern. We've been monitoring it at NASA's Deep Signal Division. You somehow intercepted it." "I didn't intercept anything," she said sharply. "It found me." A pause. Then his low voice. "You might want to get some air, Evelyn. We'll talk soon. Don't share this with anyone." The line went dead. Evelyn stared at the monitor again. The waveforms were gone, replaced by static. Only one fragment remained in her neural log, glowing faintly in amber. "Do you believe in God?" She blinked, her heart hammering. The question wasn't part of the signal. It was generated by her brain skin interface, the system that converted data into emotional resonance. Which meant the question had come from inside her, or worse, through her. She shut off the monitor, unplugged the mainframe, and sat in the dark, her reflection hovering in the black glass like a ghost. For a long time, she didn't move. Outside, the fog thickened, the world held its breath. By morning, her inbox was flooded with encrypted messages from NASA's internal network. Reyes had sent a single line. "They're sending someone to you, don't panic." The message was time-stamped 5:03 a.m., 2 hours before she even checked it. How did he know she hadn't slept? At 9:17 a.m., a knock echoed down the hall. 3 sharp raps, not faculty, not students. When she opened the door, a man in a black coat stood there, his ID clipped to his lapel. Agent Noah Quinn, Federal Investigative Unit. Dr. Cross, he said, his voice even and low. May I come in? She hesitated. This is MIT property. I can't. NASA requested a liaison. I'm only here to ensure national security protocols are observed. He stepped inside without waiting for her consent, scanning the lab with quiet precision. His gaze lingered on the dormant monitors. You accessed the Perseus data last night? I didn't access anything, it accessed me. He looked at her then, truly looked. His eyes were pale gray, unreadable. You felt it, didn't you? The question sent a shiver through her. Felt what? The message. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The hum of the servers filled the silence like an echo chamber. I don't know what I felt, she said finally, but it wasn't human. Noah's lips curved slightly, not a smile, more an acknowledgement. That's exactly what the last one said. She froze. The last one, he didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small metallic disc, no bigger than a coin. He placed it on the table. It emitted a faint blue glow. This is a classified transceiver. It records localized electromagnetic activity, specifically the kind that interacts with neural tissue. She frowned. You think I'm being monitored? I think you've been contacted, he said quietly. And you need to decide whether you want to understand it or survive it. Evelyn laughed nervously. You're talking like this is some kind of possession. No, I didn't flinch. In the old world, they called it prophecy. In ours, we call it data. The words hit her like a cold wind. Prophecy. Her mother's voice again, echoing from years ago, just before she died. You'll hear it too, one day. The voice that calls itself God. Evelyn stepped back. Agent Quinn, I think you should leave. He nodded slowly, of course, but when it starts talking again, don't ignore it. He tapped the metal disc. This will record everything for your own protection. When he left, the silence returned heavy, aware. She turned the disc over in her hand. It pulsed faintly, almost alive. That night, she returned home to her apartment overlooking the Charles River. The city lights shimmered on the water like broken constellations. She poured herself a glass of wine, trying to quiet the hum that had returned behind her ear. Her apartment was filled with books, neuroscience journals, quantum consciousness studies, and one old Bible that belonged to her mother. It was open on the coffee table, a pressed flower marking Genesis 6, and the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. She closed it. Her laptop was still connected to the neural system back at MIT through a secure channel. Curiosity overrode fear. She activated the data retrieval script. The interface came alive, reconstructing the signal she'd captured. For several seconds, only static filled the screen. Then the waveforms reassembled themselves smooth, deliberate. The hum in her skull grew stronger, aligning perfectly with the rhythm on the monitor. Her heart raced. Show me what you want, she whispered. The screen flickered. Lines of symbols appeared, like geometric prayer circles within circles, spirals wrapped around sigils she didn't recognize. And then, among them, one symbol glowed brighter, an eye. The same eye she had seen in her mind. Suddenly, the lights in her apartment dimmed. Every electronic device powered down, leaving only the glow of the screen and the faint vibration in her head. Then came a voice, not through speakers, not through air, but through her. It wasn't male or female, not even a sound, but a sensation, a flood of meaning that formed words only after passing through her thoughts. You have been chosen to translate. Evelyn's breath hitched. Translate what? The final message. From who? Silence, then a pulse so intense it blurred her vision. Her body convulsed, the glass fell from her hand and shattered. When she came to, she was on the floor, trembling, her head buzzing like static. The monitor now displayed a sentence in perfect English. We are the witnesses of God's final plan, she gasped. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, desperate to type a reply. What plan? What are you talking about? The cursor blinked. One word appeared, prepare. The screen went black. She sat in the dark, chest heaving, the reflection of her own eyes in the dead monitor looking back at her wider, older, almost alien. Outside, Thunder rolled across the horizon, though no storm was forecast. Her phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. "He's watching you. Don't trust Reyes." Her pulse stopped for a second. She looked out the window. Across the river on the opposite bank, a single light flickered in a government building, one of NASA's research annexes. And standing in that light, barely visible through the glass, was a silhouette. A man or something shaped like one watching her. The hum in her head returned, louder now, almost like breathing. And then, deep within the noise, a voice whispered, soft, intimate, and terrifyingly familiar, "Evelyn, do you still believe in God?" Her wine glass lay shattered on the floor, the dark stain spreading like a shadow around her feet. Somewhere between faith and fear, she realized this was not just a signal. It was a summons, and the question it carried would change the fate of every soul on Earth. The next morning, Evelyn woke with her head pressed against the hardwood floor. For a moment, she couldn't remember how she got there. The fragments of the nightlight flickering, the alien symbols, the word prepare felt like a half-remembered dream etched behind her eyelids. Her pulse still carried the faint echo of that rhythmic hum, the one that had burrowed deep into her skull. She rose unsteadily, blinking at the faint morning light that filtered through the blinds. Her laptop sat closed on the table, but she could feel it awake, humming faintly. She reached toward it, hesitating before lifting the lid. The screen flashed once and then opened to a blank interface. No signal, no data logs, only one file remained on her desktop. It was titled neural pattern _01. Her fingers trembled as she double-clicked. The file opened as a waveform display oscillating, hypnotic, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. And then, without warning, the sound returned not from the speakers, but inside her. A deep resonance vibrating through her bones. She could see the sound, like ripples in her vision. Every pulse seemed to alter something behind her eyes, reprogramming the rhythm of her thoughts. "Stop," she whispered, clutching her temples, but it didn't stop. The signal wasn't coming from the laptop anymore, it was coming through her. Her phone buzzed on the table. The caller ID read Dr. Michael Reyes. She snatched it up. "Michael, something's happening to me." "I know," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Don't panic, it's the neural resonance. The signal syncs with cortical oscillations. You need to ground yourself before what? Before it rewires you." Evelyn froze. "You knew this could happen. I didn't know it would happen to you," he said. "Evelyn, listen, last night you triggered an interactive response. The message isn't just data, it's adaptive. It learns from the mind that receives it." She sank into a chair, trying to breathe. "It's inside my head. I can feel it changing my thoughts." There was a silence on the line, followed by a soft exhale. "You're not the first, Evelyn. But you might be the first one to understand what it wants." She wanted to ask more, but something in his tone made her pause, a hesitation, like he was holding back something vital. "Where are you right now?" she asked. "NASA's classified site near the river," he said. "And before you ask, yes, I saw you from the window." Her blood ran cold. "That was you." "It wasn't supposed to be. Quinn was there before me." She gripped the phone tighter. "Agent Noah Quinn?" "Yes, he's not what he claims to be. Be careful with him. He believes the signal is divine. But if he's right, it's not a god we've ever known." Before she could reply, the connection crackled, then died. Her phone went dark. Evelyn stared at her reflection in the black screen. The faintest shimmer moved across her pupils like liquid light. The neural pattern was no longer just in her brain, it was manifesting through her. Her laptop beeped once. A new message appeared, but it wasn't from Michael. It was a visual sequence of geometric shapes rotating slowly, spirals, triangles, and then, finally, a pair of mirrored eyes. Below it, a sentence formed. "Your thoughts are the language." She touched the screen, unable to look away. "What are you?" she whispered. There was no answer, only a sudden surge of warmth behind her eyes, a pulse that spread through her veins like liquid fire. For an instant, she wasn't in her apartment anymore. She was somewhere else. A vast black expanse surrounded her, filled with moving light. Shapes flowed past like living constellations, fluid, shifting, intelligent. She heard whispers without sound, saw symbols without sight. And in the center of that void, the same eye she had seen before, burning gold, enormous, aware. Then came a voice, the voice soft, infinite. We are the echo of creation. The end begins with remembrance. Her breath caught. Remembrance of what? Of who you were before language, before time. The light intensified, surrounding her. Her body dissolved into patterns of thought and emotion, grief, wonder, awe, terror. The voice spoke again. The pattern lives in you now. You will see as we see, dream as we dream. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by light. When she opened her eyes again, she was back in her apartment. The room was silent. Her body trembled uncontrollably, sweat dripping down her face. Her neural monitor, still connected through her lab link, showed something impossible: brainwave activity across two hemispheres simultaneously mirrored. Human brains never did that. She saved the data instinctively, every part of her scientific training fighting against her terror. Then she noticed a thin line of blood trickling from her left nostril. The signal had touched her nervous system. She stumbled to the bathroom, clutching the sink. Her reflection stared back, eyes dilated, skin pale, veins faintly glowing blue under the light. She blinked, the glow faded, her phone buzzed again. A new text appeared from an unknown number. They can see through you now. Her hands shook. Who are you? She typed. No response. Only another message. Don't look directly at the mirrors. She turned slowly toward her reflection. For an instant, she saw not herself, but the outline of another face layered over hers. Human, yet not, a smooth, alien symmetry beneath her skin. She gasped, shattering the mirror with her hand. Blood dripped down her wrist, and through the pain, she heard it again, the hum, softer this time, almost comforting. Pain is just translation. Stop talking to me, she shouted. I'm not your vessel, the hum ceased. The silence that followed was worse. She bandaged her hand and grabbed her coat, deciding she needed to confront Michael in person. Whatever this thing was, he knew more than he was saying. The streets outside shimmered in the early morning light, but everything felt subtly off: the angles of buildings, the rhythm of footsteps, even the color of the sky. As she walked, people passed her without a glance, but she could feel their emotions, fragments of thought brushing against her consciousness. Fear, hunger, boredom, pain all bleeding into her awareness like static. She clutched her head. No, no, no. Her phone rang again. This time, it was Agent Noah Quinn. Dr. Cross, he said before she could speak. You're experiencing neural contamination. How do you know that? Because I've seen it before. The message interacts with mirror neurons. It starts by sensing your perception with others. You're not hallucinating, you're merging. Then how do I stop it? You don't, he said. You learn to separate what's yours from what's not. Evelyn stopped walking, staring at her trembling hands. You knew this would happen. You let it happen. I didn't let it happen, he said. I warned you. But you didn't listen, her mind spun. You said the last one felt it too. What happened to them? A pause. They started seeing what comes after death. Before she could ask more, the call ended. Evelyn stood in the middle of the street, trembling, her thoughts unraveling into strange shapes. The air shimmered around her as if reality itself were a thin film, ready to tear, and then she felt it, someone watching. Across the road stood Michael Reyes. He raised a hand gently, signaling her to stay calm. When she approached, he led her into a quiet alley, his expression grave. I told you not to connect again, he said. I didn't, it connected to me. He exhaled, eyes shadowed, then it's begun. What has? The integration. The signal structure matches parts of human DNA non-coding sequences we thought were dormant. It's not just communicating. It's activating them. Evelyn's stomach twisted. You mean it's changing me genetically, not just you? Everyone exposed to the broadcast last night. It went public for 7 seconds before the systems shut it down. That's enough to see the pattern. I didn't, it connected to me. He exhaled, eyes shadowed, then it's begun. What has the integration? The signal structure matches parts of human DNA non-coding sequences we thought were dormant. It's not just communicating. It's activating them. Evelyn's stomach twisted. You mean it's changing me genetically, not just you? Everyone exposed to the broadcast last night. It went public for 7 seconds before the systems shut it down. That's enough to see the pattern. She looked up at him, fear and fascination mingling in her eyes. You think it has a plan? He nodded slowly. It calls itself the Voice. It says it carries God's final plan. Her breath caught. Then we're not decoding a message, she said softly. We're deciphering a prophecy. Michael's gaze hardened. And prophecies always demand a sacrifice. The hum returned deep inside her skull, almost tender this time. Evelyn swayed, gripping the wall. For a fleeting moment, she could hear distant whispers, thousands of them layered voices merging into one consciousness. She whispered, "It's learning to speak through me." Michael caught her shoulders. Then we're running out of time. The world seemed to tilt, her vision darkening at the edges. As she collapsed, she heard the voice one last time, echoing through her fading consciousness. You are the bridge. Through you, they will see. When she opened her eyes again, she was in a cold, sterile room, fluorescent lights above, medical monitors beeping softly. She wasn't alone. Noah Quinn stood beside the bed, expression unreadable. Welcome back, Dr. Cross, he said quietly. You've been unconscious for 6 hours. Her throat was dry. Where's Michael? Noah's gaze didn't waver. Gone. Gone where? He slipped his hands into his pockets. We don't know, but he left something for you. He handed her a small metallic disc, the same kind he'd given her before. This one pulsed with a steady, blue rhythm. Evelyn pressed it to her palm. The pulse matched her heartbeat exactly. Agent Quinn, she whispered, fear blooming in her chest. What happens if the pattern completes? He looked at her, eyes pale and calm. Then humanity will remember what it was created for. The hum in her skull deepened again. Outside, thunder rumbled though the sky was clear. And somewhere in the unseen frequencies between heartbeats, the voice whispered its first command, begin translation. The hum of the lab's fluorescent lights had become an almost comforting presence for Evelyn Cross. MIT's Neural Systems division was quiet that morning, eerily so. The air carried a density that pressed against her skin, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The signal, that impossible sequence of neural frequencies, still flickered on her screen, pulsing like a heartbeat that didn't belong to this world. Evelyn's eyes were dry from sleepless nights, yet she couldn't look away. The pattern had begun changing again. It no longer behaved like simple data, it reacted. When she blinked, it shifted as though aware of her attention. Every time she tried to map it, it moved beyond comprehension, rewriting itself in real time. She whispered under her breath, "You're not supposed to do that." Behind her, the soft click of a door latch echoed through the sterile room. Evelyn turned sharply. A man in a charcoal gray suit entered, his steps unhurried, his eyes already scanning every monitor before acknowledging her. His presence was like gravity, silent, but undeniable. "Dr. Evelyn Cross," he said. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority. "I'm Agent Noah Quinn, Department of Advanced Aerospace Threat Assessment." Evelyn frowned, crossing her arms. "That's classified government work. You're far from Washington." He offered a faint smile, the kind that concealed more than it revealed. "So are you?" Evelyn's stomach tightened. Behind his composed demeanor, there was something unsettling and intensity in his gaze that felt almost devotional. He walked closer to the signal display, watching the pulsing frequencies reflect across his face. "This is it," he murmured, "the pattern that's been interfering with global neural telemetry. We've been tracking it since it first appeared." "You're the one who isolated it." Evelyn tilted her head. "Tracking it? You mean this has happened elsewhere?" Noah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed a small black folder from his coat. Inside were photographs, satellite images, brain scans, audio spectrograms, all marked with red government seals. 3 cases, he said, across different continents. Each time, the same frequency spike, 23 Hz modulation, nested within background cosmic noise. And each time, a scientist working on high-band neural resonance technology suffered. He hesitated, flipping to the next page. Evelyn's breath caught. The image was of a woman, pale, eyes open but empty, her brain scan overlaid with fractal-like neural activity that spiraled infinitely inward. Her brain never stopped firing, Noah said, not even after she died. Evelyn took a step back, her pulse quickened. "What do you think this is?" He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something flicker behind his expression faith. "I don't think," he said softly, "I believe." And belief, Dr. Cross, is sometimes more dangerous than thought. Evelyn turned back to her monitors, refusing to meet his eyes. Belief doesn't decode data. Noah moved closer, lowering his voice. Neither does denial. There was silence between them, heavy and brittle. Evelyn's reflection stared back from the glass surface of the monitor, dark circles under her eyes, hair tied back hastily, the exhaustion of obsession etched into her face. He continued, "You've been in contact with Dr. Michael Reyes, haven't you?" Evelyn froze. "How do you know about that?" "We monitor all communications related to anomalous deep space signals," Noah said. "Reyes was one of ours once, now he's off-grid, running private analyses under a NASA proxy. If he's reached out to you, it means he's seen the same thing and he's scared." Evelyn tried to steady her voice. "Michael's not scared, he's careful." Noah's lips curved slightly. "That's what people say before they disappear." Her blood ran cold. "Disappear." He didn't elaborate. Instead, he stepped forward, pressing a small drive into her palm. "This contains data from all known events linked to your signal. I need you to continue your analysis, but under my supervision. From this point on, you're under federal observation." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Observation? This is my research, MIT's project." Noah's tone hardened. "Not anymore. This goes beyond academia. You've stumbled onto something theological." She laughed softly, incredulous. "You're kidding. You think this is divine?" Noah looked at the shifting frequencies on her monitor, symbols emerging from static, lines converging like a sigil. "Tell me that doesn't look like language or prayer." Evelyn's heart skipped. The pattern did look like something like sacred geometry unfolding, alive and deliberate. For a moment, she almost felt it feel her back. She stepped away, rubbing her temples. "I don't need another conspiracy theorist in my lab." Noah didn't react. He only said, "Dr. Cross, have you heard the voice?" The question landed like a thunderclap. Evelyn turned slowly toward him. "What did you say?" "The voice," he repeated. "The transmission isn't just visual. It embeds itself in auditory cortices, sometimes even in dreams. Some recipients describe it as hearing their own thoughts only." "Not their own." Her throat tightened. She thought of the last few nights, waking up to faint whispers, symbols forming behind her eyelids. The sensation of someone else inside her consciousness. She lied anyway. "No, I haven't heard anything." Noah watched her carefully, then nodded once, as if noting her denial for the record. "Good," he said, "because once you do, it never stops." Before she could respond, her main monitor flickered violently. The signal spiked, tread lines dancing across the screen, forming a waveform that resembled a voice print. The lab lights dimmed, and a low hum filled the room. Evelyn's computer speakers crackled. "Is this you?" Noah whispered. Evelyn's fingers hovered above the keyboard. "It's not transmitting, it's responding." The waveform pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Then a faint modulation emerged like distant breathing, layered within the static. The hum grew louder until the speakers hissed with unbearable clarity. Then came the whisper. Not in English, not in any known phoneme. But her brain understood. A flood of imagery, light, symbols, emotion burned through her neurons. She gasped, clutching her head as pain and revelation merged. The words, if they could be called, that formed inside her. "We are the echo, we are what you called God." Noah shouted her name, but his voice was distant, distorted. Evelyn's knees buckled as the room around her blurred into light. For an instant, she wasn't in the lab. She was somewhere else, a vast field of luminescent geometry, endless and breathing. She could feel consciousness stretching, intertwining, alive, then, just as suddenly, it was gone. Evelyn collapsed against the console, gasping for air. The signal returned to normal, the monitors calm as if nothing had happened. Noah knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "Evelyn, what did you see?" Her eyes were wide, unfocused. It spoke. Noah's expression darkened. "Then it's begun." Evelyn looked up, trembling. "What is it?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "The government calls it the voice of the architects. A signal believed to predate human civilization. Every contact ends the same way: visions, madness, sometimes." Conversion. Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. Conversion to what? Noah stood, his gaze distant. Faith. The monitors flickered again, just for an instant. A new line of data scrolled across the screen, characters that weren't human, forming a single phrase before vanishing. "Prepare for the awakening." Evelyn stared at the empty monitor, her breath shallow. Outside, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the Cambridge sky. Somewhere deep inside her mind, beneath reason and fear, a single thought whispered in bidden, "Inevitable, it knows me." Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next chapter of the Signal Chronicles. The truth is only beginning to surface. The lab was silent after the storm. Only the faint hum of equipment filled the space. But it no longer sounded mechanical, it pulsed like breath. Dr. Evelyn Cross sat on the floor, her back against the console, her mind still echoing with fragments of the signal that had spoken to her. The phrase, "We are what you called God," replayed in her thoughts like a wound that refused to close. Agent Noah Quinn stood a few steps away, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, urgent, and restrained. "Yes, she made contact." "No, not auditory hallucination, neurological synchronization." "I saw it happen." He paused, then added, "We'll need containment protocols immediately." Evelyn's head lifted at that word. Containment. It made her sound like a virus. She forced herself to her feet, still dizzy. "You're not putting me in a box, Quinn. Whatever just happened, it's in the data. I can prove it." He turned to her, eyes cold but conflicted. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." The moment you heard that voice, it linked to you. "You're a receiver now." "A receiver?" She repeated, incredulous. "You make it sound like possession." He didn't deny it. Evelyn shook her head, pacing across the lab. "I study neural harmonics for a living. I know when my brain is creating an illusion. That wasn't imagination. It was contact." Noah stepped closer. "And you think that's a good thing?" Evelyn's anger cracked through her exhaustion. "You came here to watch me, to control this, but you don't even know what this is. You're treating it like a threat because that's all the government ever does." Noah's jaw tightened. "Because every time something like this happens, people die." That stopped her. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw the weight behind his composure: grief, maybe guilt. He continued, quieter now. "In 2009, a team in Nevada picked up a similar anomaly. They tried to translate it. Within a week, two scientists suffered cerebral hemorrhages. The rest began to speak in symbols they couldn't explain. They said the message wasn't meant to be heard by human minds." Evelyn felt her chest tighten. "Then why am I still standing?" "Because maybe," he said slowly, "it chose you." The words hung between them like static. Evelyn turned away, staring at the neural display still glowing faintly on the screen. Chose her. The idea felt both terrifying and strangely intimate. Before she could respond, the lab lights flickered again. A thin tone seeped through the air, barely audible, but resonant, like a memory of sound. Both of them froze, the monitors shifted on their own, the data rearranging into a circular pattern. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she watched. Noah reached for his gun out of instinct. Step back, Evelyn ignored him. She approached the screen, transfixed. It's not random, she whispered. It's forming a structure. The pattern solidified an intricate mandala of light, rotating slowly, symbols nested within symbols. As it turned, a faint shimmer filled the room, almost imperceptible at first. Then, the air itself seemed to vibrate, as though the signal wasn't just visible, it was manifesting. Evelyn's heart raced. It's projecting neural imagery, like it's trying to translate itself. Noah's voice dropped to a whisper, "Evelyn, step away from it." But she couldn't. The symbols moved faster, aligning into something recognizable shapes resembling human DNA strands. Her breath caught. No, it can't be. Noah glanced at her. What? It's embedding biological code into the transmission. This isn't communication, it's insertion. It's rewriting the signal pathways it touches. Noah stared at the screen, his expression unreadable, meaning what, exactly? She turned to him, voice trembling. Meaning my brain isn't just hearing it anymore, it's changing to understand it. Before he could respond, Evelyn's vision blurred. The lab dissolved into blackness. For a moment, she wasn't in her body. She was floating in a space without air, surrounded by luminous threads that pulsed with consciousness. A presence stirred among them, vast, ancient, and intimate, the same feeling she'd sensed before. We are the architects, it said, not in words, but through emotion and memory. You are the bridge, Evelyn's breath caught. The imagery that followed was overwhelming, a planet dissolving into light, a collective mind rising beyond flesh, humanity standing on the edge of something divine. Then came the pain, a searing flood of information that tore through her neurons like fire. Her body convulsed. She fell to the floor. Noah dropped beside her, shouting her name, but she couldn't hear him. The voice filled her, and for a heartbeat, she understood everything, the pattern, the purpose, the unbearable beauty of it. Then it was gone. Evelyn gasped as the lab came back into focus. Her temples throbbed. Noah held her steady. You're bleeding, he said, staring at the thin stream of blood trickling from her nose. She wiped it away, dazed. It showed me something. Something about us, about evolution. Noah's tone was sharp. Don't tell me you believe it. She looked up at him, eyes wide with both terror and wonder. It's not about belief anymore. It's truth. He rose to his feet, pacing. The last person who said that ended up worshipping the signal like a god. Evelyn stood slowly, her knees weak. Maybe that's what it is. Noah turned sharply. You sound like my father. Evelyn blinked. Your father. He exhaled heavily, the first real crack in his composure. He was part of Project Seraph, the first classified contact attempt. He believed the message was divine, said it came to finish what creation started. I thought he'd lost his mind until he disappeared. Something deep and human flickered in his eyes, a mix of fear and faith. Evelyn didn't speak. Finally, Noah said, whatever this is, it's not benevolent. It infects belief, turns it into obedience. And if you let it, it will take everything you are. Evelyn stared at the monitor, now blank, as if the signal had gone dormant again. Maybe obedience isn't what it wants, she whispered. Maybe it wants comprehension. He shook his head. You sound just like him. Evelyn turned to face him, her voice low but steady. Maybe he was right. The air between them felt electric. For the first time, Noah didn't have an answer. He simply watched her as she approached the console again, her hand hovering over the activation key. Don't, he warned. She pressed it. The screen came alive, this time not with light but with sound. A deep resonance filled the room, vibrating through their bones. The frequency was lower, more structured, almost like a chant. Evelyn's pulse synchronized with it involuntarily. The entire lab seemed to thrum in rhythm. She whispered, barely audible, it's beautiful. Noah grabbed her arm. It's dangerous. She met his gaze. You can't stop what's already awake. Then the lights cut out, total darkness. The hum stopped. In this silence, something moved to flicker on the periphery of perception, like a thought too large for the human brain to hold. Both of them stood frozen. From the blackness, a faint whisper emerged. Not through the speakers, not from the signal, but from within. Noah turned pale. Evelyn heard it too. The voice spoke softly, almost tenderly. "The others are listening." Evelyn's heart pounded as she realized this time the sound hadn't come from the lab. It had come from inside her mind. Noah stepped back, his face lit only by the emergency light blinking red in the corner. "What did it say?" he asked. Evelyn swallowed hard. That we're not alone anymore. The alarm began to blare. The monitors rebooted one by one, displaying a new line of code she didn't recognize. Connection established. Somewhere deep beneath it, something began to awaken. And in the dim light, Evelyn Cross felt the first true fracture in her sanity, something inside her whispering that maybe, just maybe, the voice wasn't reaching toward her at all. It was coming through her. If you're following this discovery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The truth is no longer hidden, it's speaking. When Evelyn woke the next morning, the world outside her apartment looked the same: gray clouds over Cambridge, soft drizzle streaking down the windows, but inside her mind, nothing felt familiar anymore. Every sound carried an undertone, every flicker of light hummed with invisible structure. She couldn't stop hearing it, the rhythm beneath reality, a faint pulse that matched her heartbeat. The signal hadn't left her, it was living inside her. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the mug in her hands. The coffee had gone cold, sleep had been impossible. Each time she drifted off, she saw the same image, a spiral of light opening like an eye, and a whisper that wasn't quite human: "You are the bridge." Her phone buzzed, and the name on the screen sent a shock through her chest: Dr. Michael Reyes. For a long moment, she didn't move. They hadn't spoken in months, not since the conference in Geneva, where he'd walked out halfway through her presentation on neural synchronization and refused to explain why. Back then, she thought it was professional jealousy. Now, she wasn't so sure. She answered Michael. His voice was calm. To calm, "Evelyn, I heard what happened at the lab." Her pulse quickened. "You're not supposed to know that. I still have access," he said softly. "You triggered a restricted signal channel. That means the division is watching you now." Division, the deep signal division. "My division," Evelyn stood, moving toward the window as if distance could steady her. "You're saying this isn't the first time something like this happened?" A pause. "No," he said finally, "it's the third." The word sank into her like ice. "The third? I can't talk about it on an open line," he continued. "Meet me tonight, Cambridge Observatory, after dark." And Evelyn, don't tell Quinn, the line went dead before she could respond. All day, the message replayed in her head. By the time night fell, the sky had cleared. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with the scent of ozone. She walked quickly through the empty campus toward the observatory, her footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. The building loomed ahead, its dome glowing faintly under the sodium lights. Inside, the air was still and cold. Michael stood by one of the telescopes, hands in the pockets of his dark coat. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held the same haunted intensity she remembered. "You shouldn't have come," he said, though he'd been the one to call her. "I didn't have a choice," she replied. "You said it's happened before." "I need to know everything." He hesitated, then exhaled. 15 years ago, the first signal was detected by the Arecibo array in Puerto Rico, a pulse repeating every 13 hours. The data was dismissed as interference, but the neural imprint it left on one of the researchers was identical to what's happening to you. Evelyn's breath caught. "You mean someone else?" "Dr. Naomi Chen," he interrupted, astrophysicist. "She started showing the same symptoms you're describing: synesthetic perception, auditory distortions, dream intrusion. Within a month, she claimed she was receiving direct messages from what she called the architects of consciousness." Evelyn felt a chill crawl down her spine. What happened to her? Michael's jaw tightened. She vanished. 2 days before a scheduled debrief with the Pentagon and the second case, he hesitated again. That one was off record. A Russian facility in 2019, they were trying to reproduce the signal artificially. They succeeded. For 6 minutes, every scientist in that lab suffered neural collapse. The surviving logs described something impossible, a shared hallucination of a living lattice made of light. The transmission contained biological data, DNA sequences, but not human. Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper, and now it's happening again. He nodded, only this time it's stronger. And it's targeting you. Why me, Michael? She asked, her tone cracking. Why not you or Quinn? Why am I the one hearing it? Michael's gaze softened. Because your brain is already tuned to collective frequencies. Your research on neural resonance, your experiments with cross-brain synchronization, they made you the perfect conduit. Evelyn turned away, the weight of realization sinking into her bones. So I did this to myself. No, he said firmly, stepping closer. You didn't summon it. You just opened the door it could walk through. She closed her eyes, trying to breathe, but the air felt too thin. Then what is it, Michael? What are they? He hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small flash drive. He placed it on the metal railing between them. You'll find part of the answer here. Classified Data Project Eve, they think it stands for Extraterrestrial Voice Experiment, but that's a lie. Evelyn frowned. Then what does it stand for? Michael's voice was low, almost a whisper, encoded vision entity. The project wasn't about receiving alien communication. It was about recreating it. She stared at him. You mean they tried to build their own god? Something like that, he said quietly. They thought if consciousness could be modeled as a quantum field, it could be rewrite and merged with the source of the signal. But something went wrong. The entity they generated didn't follow commands. It started sending messages to specific individuals. The same individuals who worked on decoding the original pattern. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears, and you worked on that project. Michael's eyes met hers. Yes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, almost sacred. Evelyn felt her thoughts spiral. Project Eve, neural resonance, the message about God's final plan. It all connected, somehow, but the shape of it was still hidden. Finally, she asked, why tell me now? Because, he said, his voice trembling slightly, you're already part of it. The signal that contacted you, it's not a new transmission, it's the same one. It's been circling the planet for years, waiting for someone with your neural profile, and once it finds the right host. He trailed off. Host, she repeated. Michael looked away. It begins integration. Her stomach turned. Integration into what? He didn't answer. The observatory lights flickered, dimmed, then stabilized. A static hum filled the air, low, deep, familiar. Evelyn's head throbbed as the sound grew sharper. She clutched the railing for balance. Michael, he looked up sharply, realizing it too. The signal, it was here. The computers in the corner of the observatory began activating on their own. Data streamed across the screen's binary strings interlaced with geometric symbols. Evelyn's vision blurred, and for an instant, she saw something through the data. The image of an immense structure orbiting beyond Jupiter, alive with light. It's broadcasting again, she gasped. Michael stepped forward. Evelyn, listen to me. You have to shut it down. I can't, she said through gritted teeth. It's not coming from the systems, it's coming through me. Asterisk. The floor seemed to vibrate with the resonance. Evelyn dropped to her knees, her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't in the air, it was inside her skull. Michael crouched beside her, his hand gripping her shoulder. Stay with me, Evelyn, focus on my voice. Her eyes snapped open, and for a heartbeat, they glowed faintly silver, like reflections of starlight. Her voice trembled. It's showing me, us, the signal. It's mapping consciousness across the species. It's choosing. Michael's breath caught. Choosing what? Who survives? She whispered. She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. You knew this would happen. didn't you?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, softly, "I hoped it wouldn't." Evelyn's expression hardened. "You lied to me," he exhaled. "No, I just didn't tell you that. I've heard it too." Her blood ran cold. "You what?" Michael's voice was almost a confession. 3 years ago, after the experiment in Nevada, I started hearing fragments, echoes, but only when I was near electromagnetic fields. It was like it was searching for someone to complete the pattern. I thought it stopped. I was wrong. He looked at her, his eyes full of something between fear and awe. "The moment you activated the signal at MIT, it came back, louder, clearer. Evelyn, it's not just in you anymore. It's spreading." Evelyn's hands trembled. "Then what are we supposed to do?" Michael took a deep breath. "We find where it's coming from." Before it finished whatever it started, a long silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft hum of the telescope motors. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon like a warning. Evelyn glanced at the flash drive still on the railing. "And if we can't stop it?" Michael's gaze met hers, unwavering. "Then humanity will have to face its creator." Evelyn looked toward the sky, where the clouds had parted just enough for one star to shine through. But to her altered mind, it didn't look like a star anymore. It looked like an eye watching, waiting. Somewhere in the back of her mind, the voice whispered again, gentle and calm, "The plan has begun." And Evelyn Cross understood, with cold certainty, that whatever Michael was hiding, it was only the beginning. If you've been following the signal, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The truth is closer than ever and it's listening. The sterile air inside the underground facility pressed heavy against Evelyn's skin. Every surface gleamed under the cold fluorescence of overhead lights, stainless steel tables, glass panels, biometric scanners. It was not MIT, it wasn't even a government lab she could identify. Noah had called it Section Theta, a place that didn't exist on any official record. Somewhere deep beneath the Nevada desert, she now stood in front of a chamber that redefined the boundaries between science and sacrilege. Inside the chamber, a human lay connected to dozens of translucent cables that pulsed faintly with a rhythm too irregular to be mechanical. The figure was male, perhaps in his 30s, but his expression was eerily peaceful, almost serene, even as electrodes covered his scalp like a crown of silver thorns. Evelyn froze. On the monitors beside him, she saw it again, the pattern. The same neural wave she had discovered in the alien signal. Only now it wasn't coming from the stars, it was firing inside a human brain. "This is impossible," she whispered, unable to look away. "You're telling me he's alive?" Michael, standing beside her in a lab coat that didn't quite hide the fatigue in his eyes, nodded grimly. "Alive, yes. Conscious ... Not exactly. His name is Daniel Kerrigan, former Navy engineer. He volunteered 3 years ago for a classified neural study. But the experiment ... changed him." Evelyn's gaze darted to the data streams running down the side of the monitor. The brain waves weren't random, they pulsed in fractal symmetry, interlocking with frequencies that mirrored the original alien transmission. Every few seconds, a spike of light flickered across the EEG, followed by a faint hum in the room's electromagnetic field. It was as if the air itself reacted to his mind. "Michael," she said quietly, "he's broadcasting." He turned toward her, his jaw tightening. "That's why I brought you here. The signal in his brain, it's not self-generated. It's being fed from an external source, the same source you picked up at MIT." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "You mean? The signal isn't just communication," he interrupted. "It's integration, it's trying to link with human consciousness." Daniel was the first attempt, or the first successful one. She stepped closer to the glass, her reflection hovering over the sleeping man. Beneath the cables, his body barely moved, but his fingers twitched occasionally, like a pianist playing invisible keys. On the monitors, every movement corresponded with bursts of patterned light, repeating geometric structures, almost like ancient mandalas encoded in electrical pulses. "Why wasn't I told?" she demanded. Noah Quinn's voice answered from behind her. Because you weren't supposed to be here, Dr. Cross. His reflection appeared next to hers in the glass, calm and unreadable. The black suit, the subtle glint of his ID badge, everything about him radiated control. Yet beneath that polished surface, Evelyn sensed something else, fear. "Noah," she said, turning toward him, "you knew about this project." He didn't deny it. "I knew about the precursor events. There were 3 before this: Argentina, Kazakhstan, and one off the coast of Japan. Each time, we detected fragments of the same signal, each one stronger, more invasive. The only survivor from the Kazakhstan incident was Daniel Kerrigan. He was the first to manifest the full neural pattern." "Manifest," Evelyn repeated. "Like a disease?" "Like a conversion," Noah replied flatly. He began speaking in symbols, drawing patterns in the air. The linguists couldn't translate it, but the theologians ... double quotes. He hesitated, searching for words. They called it revelation. Evelyn looked back at the unconscious man. "You're saying he was communicating with the voice?" Michael's eyes met hers. "We don't call it that here." She ignored him. "You should, because that's what it is. That's what's been trying to reach me. And now you've connected it to a living brain." The hum in the chamber deepened. The lights dimmed slightly, and for a brief moment, the pulse of Daniel's neural signal synchronized perfectly with the room's electrical system. The monitors flickered. Evelyn felt a faint vibration beneath her feet, not seismic, but internal, as if the frequency had found its way into her bones. "Power fluctuation," one of the technicians muttered. "Stabilizing," but Evelyn wasn't convinced. She pressed her hand against the glass. The hum grew louder, resonating with a pattern she recognized not from the lab, but from her dreams. It was the same rhythm that had whispered through her subconscious since the signal first reached her. Michael grabbed her wrist gently. "Evelyn, don't, you shouldn't." Before he could finish, Daniel's eyes snapped open. Gasps echoed across the room. His irises glowed faintly, not with color but with light, a pale radiance that shimmered beneath the surface like liquid mercury. His lips moved soundlessly, and then a voice, not his, filled the room. "I see you, Evelyn Cross." The sound wasn't coming from his mouth. It reverberated inside her head, a whisper that bypassed air and language. Evelyn staggered back, clutching her temples as the words burned like electricity behind her eyes. Images flashed, stars collapsing, oceans rising, human figures dissolving into waves of light. Michael shouted something, but his voice was drowned by the noise. The equipment overloaded, monitors bursting into static. The technician scrambled to shut it down, but Daniel's body convulsed violently, his muscles seizing as if some invisible current was tearing through him. "Noah," Evelyn cried, "we have to stop it." But Noah's gaze was fixed on the man in the chamber, or rather, on what was speaking through him. His face was pale, transfixed. "It's not attacking," he murmured, "it's communing." "Communing," Evelyn shouted. "He's dying." "Or ascending," Noah whispered. Evelyn slammed her hand on the emergency control panel. The chamber doors sealed, and the power feed cut instantly. The hum stopped, silence swallowed the room. Daniel lay motionless, smoke curling from the electrodes on his temples. Everyone stood frozen. Finally, Evelyn exhaled shakily. What the hell just happened? Michael moved to the control board, scanning the readouts. His neural signature spiked to 500 Hz before blackout. That's beyond human tolerance, but he hesitated. There's still brain activity. Low but present, Evelyn stared at the data. The pattern had changed. It no longer matched the alien frequency. Instead, it was something new, a hybrid waveform, neither human nor entirely foreign. Noah stepped closer, his voice low. "He's the bridge." Evelyn turned to him sharply. "A bridge to what?" "To what's coming," he said, the voice told him. "It's preparing humanity for alignment. You've heard it too, haven't you, Dr. Cross?" Evelyn's silence was enough. "No," I nodded slowly. Michael's tone hardened. "Don't start with your divine nonsense. Quinn, this isn't revelation, it's neurological manipulation. Call it what you want, Noah said, his expression grave. But the last time this pattern emerged, before Daniel, before the others, entire cultures recorded it as prophecy. The Mayan glyphs, the Sumerian tablets, the Dead Sea fragments, all share the same frequency sequence. It's always the same voice. Evelyn whispered, almost to herself, God's final plan. The words hung heavy in the sterile air. Michael closed his eyes, his voice barely audible. If that's true, then we've already crossed the line. Whatever this thing is, it's no longer just out there. It's in us. The lights flickered once more. On the monitor, Daniel's brainwave surged, a soft pulse that repeated twice, then faded. Evelyn felt something inside her chest tighten in response, like her heartbeat sensing to the rhythm. The room fell silent again, but the connection had already been made. Deep down, she knew Daniel wasn't the only test subject anymore. Somewhere in the dark, the voice was listening and it had chosen her next. Time no longer moved in the way Evelyn remembered. It flowed unevenly, like a dream trying to hold itself together after waking. The clocks in section theta ticked, but not in rhythm. Sometimes the second hand froze mid-motion, other times it skipped ahead, leaping through entire minutes. Her own pulse felt mismatched to her breath. The hum she once thought was mechanical, from the servers, from the monitors, now came from somewhere deeper, perhaps from inside her skull. Daniel Kerrigan was still alive. His body had stabilized, but his brain activity defied every known biological parameter. The hybrid waveform pulsed every 12 seconds, radiating outward like ripples in invisible water. And every time it did, the world seemed to stutter, a flicker in the fluorescent light. A faint afterimage of herself moving a half-second behind. Evelyn could no longer tell if she was observing it or if it was observing her. She hadn't slept in 40 hours. Michael had tried to convince her to rest, but rest was meaningless when time refused to obey. When she blinked, she saw moments that hadn't yet happened, Noah turning his head before he actually did, her own hand placing a coffee cup that was still on the counter. Her research notes had become a mess of crossed equations and desperate handwriting. She wrote neural phase displacement and temporal echo in red ink across the margins, but even those words felt inadequate. How could she quantify a phenomenon that seemed to rewrite causality? Michael entered the lab quietly, his expression drawn. He placed a small data drive on the table beside her. The cameras are recording it too, he said softly. It's not just in your head. She looked up. What's on it? Footage from the last 12 hours. Watch closely, he tapped the monitor. The screen displayed the corridor outside the lab, the security feed, time-stamped and looping in 30-second increments. For the first 10 minutes, everything appeared normal. Guards passing, lights flickering, technicians walking by. Then abruptly, the timestamp jumped backward 3 minutes, and the exact sequence repeated. Identical movements, identical expressions. It's a temporal recursion, Evelyn whispered. Michael nodded grimly. Every time Daniel's brainwave spikes, time folds back on itself for roughly 3 minutes. Then reality resets. She stared at the footage in disbelief. That's not possible, he gave a weary smile. Neither is a human brain broadcasting a signal across interstellar space. Yet here we are. Evelyn rubbed her temples. If time is looping, why do we remember? That's what scares me, Michael said. We shouldn't. The air around them pulsed again, faint, but enough to make the metal instruments tremble. Evelyn's pen rolled off the table, but instead of falling, it seemed to hesitate midair, vibrating in place before clattering to the floor a heartbeat later. Her breath caught. Michael, did you see that? He didn't answer immediately. His gaze was distant, focused on the glass chamber where Daniel lay. He's expanding the field, he said finally. Each spike reaches further. Time isn't just looping anymore, it's unraveling. Evelyn moved toward the observation glass. Daniel's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, but the light beneath his skin had intensified. Thin veins of luminescent silver now traced along his temples and neck, pulsing in time with the hybrid waveform. His eyes were closed, yet she felt him watching her through the barrier. Then, without warning, the hum deepened again. Lower, more resonant, the glass vibrated. Evelyn's reflection split into two. One blinked, the other didn't. "Michael," she whispered. "I think it's happening again." The lights flickered, once, twice, and suddenly the lab wasn't the same. The air shimmered like heat over asphalt. Monitors displayed images that hadn't been there before. Star fields, spirals of light, symbols she couldn't read. She looked down at her notes, and they were different too, rewritten in handwriting that wasn't hers. "What's happening?" Michael's voice came from behind her, but when she turned, he wasn't there. Instead, she saw him standing inside the chamber with Daniel, his palm resting on the unconscious man's shoulder. The same Michael, and yet outside the glass, another version of him stood frozen mid-motion, his eyes wide as if realizing the duplication too late. Evelyn stumbled backward, her heart racing. "No, this isn't real." The Michael inside the chamber turned toward her, his expression calm. "It's all real," he said softly, though his lips didn't move. "You're beginning to see it." "See what?" "The structure. The voice doesn't exist in time the way we do. It's showing us how fragile the illusion is." The world convulsed again, a shuddering wave of distortion that rippled through the walls, warping sound and light alike. Evelyn clutched the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. When it stopped, the other Michael was gone. Only one remained, standing beside her, breathing heavily. He stared at her as though she were a ghost. "Evelyn, where did you go? What do you mean?" she demanded. "You disappeared for 30 seconds. You weren't here." Her mind reeled. "That's impossible. I didn't move." Noah's voice crackled through the intercom. "Both of you get to control room A now." They followed the sound, stumbling through corridors that seemed subtly wrong, angles that didn't match memory, hallways stretching longer than they should. The fluorescent lights flickered in impossible patterns. At one point, Evelyn swore she saw herself turning a corner ahead, her same coat, her same stride, only for the figure to vanish as she approached. Inside control room, chaos reigned. Technicians argued over readings that contradicted one another. Monitors displayed distorted versions of the same live feed, each showing slightly different timelines, seconds apart. Noah stood at the center, his face pale but steady. "Whatever Kerrigan's doing, it's spreading," he said. "The field has expanded to a 3-mile radius. Civilian power grids are showing fluctuations. We've had reports of deja vu, hallucinations, missing time." Evelyn stepped closer. "We have to sedate him. Shut down his brain activity before the field consumes everything." Noah's jaw tightened. "You think this is something we can shut down? This isn't an experiment gone wrong. Dr. Cross, it's evolution." "Evolution doesn't rewrite the laws of physics," she shouted. He turned sharply toward her. "And yet it's happening. Don't you see? This is what the voice promised. Humanity isn't ending. It's transitioning." Michael slammed his hand against the console. "Into what? Into this chaos? Look around you, Quinn. This isn't divine. It's disintegration." Noah's expression hardened. "Faith requires disintegration. The old world has to collapse before the new one begins." Evelyn stepped between them, her voice trembling but firm. "You're both wrong. This isn't faith or science anymore, it's infection. It's using our perception to reshape reality itself." Before either could reply, the alarms blared. The monitors filled with static, then cleared to show the chamber. Daniel Kerrigan was awake. His eyes glowed brighter than before, twin stars burning with unnatural light. The cables attached to his skull detached themselves one by one, as if repelled by his energy. The hum in the air turned into a low harmonic resonance that made every atom vibrate. Evelyn felt the world tilt, the air shimmer. The edges of objects blurred as if melting into one another. Time fractured again. She saw Michael speaking before he actually moved his lips. Noah frozen mid-step while his voice echoed twice from different points in the room. Then Daniel spoke, or rather, something through him did. The pattern completes itself. You cannot separate what has already converged. Every screen flickered, displaying the same sigil, an intricate spiral intersected by a vertical beam of light. Evelyn recognized it instantly. It was the same symbol from her dreams, the one her mother used to draw in her theology notes, the mark she had called the Eye of God. Michael's hand found hers. Evelyn, this is the collapse point. She looked up at him, her vision splitting into countless overlays, 1,000 versions of the same moment bleeding together. Her voice came out as a whisper, "Then we have to survive it." The lights exploded into white. For a heartbeat, or a century, everything ceased. When sensation returned, Evelyn found herself lying on the floor of the lab. The alarms were silent, the room was still. But nothing felt real anymore. The walls pulsed like living tissue, and the faint hum beneath her skin whispered her name. Outside the shattered glass, Daniel was gone. Only the spiral of light remained, burning slowly into the air, and as it faded, she heard the voice again. The collapse is not the end, it is the beginning.